Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, in whichever part of the world you are. This is Dr. Geeta Sekho, your instructor, and I'm welcoming you to listen to this webinar. Since no one has joined, and I can understand the personal and professional commitments of all of you. So I'm recording this in the absence of anyone present here today, hoping that you will all have the time to then listen into this second and the last webinar of our course today on trafficking in persons. So this webinar, since we are already almost reaching the end of our course, is on multi-stakeholder responses to trafficking in human beings. And I start as usual, as you would have understood my style by now of making presentations, is to start with a quote to remind ourselves of the seriousness of this crime, where the question is not how much we need to still do, but how we can do it more and we can do it better. The topics for discussion today briefly would be about the needs of the trafficked victim, what are the strategies for these holistic responses, and we pick up just a few of the stakeholders. We will not be repeating the discussion in the pre-recorded lecture, which already exists for week 6, but we'll pick up just a few responses from a few of the stakeholders which are listed in this screen. And we'll see the challenges and what all could be the possible solutions. So let's start to discuss what could be the needs of the trafficked victim. And the needs of the trafficked victim are actually the rights of the trafficked victim, their rights to life, their right to health, their right to education, their right to freedom of movement, their right to every single right which you and I enjoy as a citizen of a country, as a citizen of the world. And within a situation of trafficking, exploitation, we know how these rights are infringed upon. They're violated by the traffickers to the extent that victims do not enjoy any of these rights which are granted to them by their constitution and their legal frameworks, or by the constitution of the destination countries where they are eventually exploited. So what are the needs of the victims that we identify? And we know how much ever controversy that there is around the word rescue. We've discussed in week 4, and it was interesting to read some of your posts on, whether rescues are misguided efforts or not. But whatever terminology we may decide to use, it remains unquestionable that the first right of the victims is their removal from their exploitative situations, whether it's a man, woman, or a child in this exploitative situation. And whatever be the nature of the exploitation, whether it is forced prostitution or forced labor, or a situation of begging, or any other situation for that matter. And having been so removed, safe accommodation and housing, whether in a shelter home or back with their families, is their prime necessity. A comprehensive list of services which takes care of their health, which includes physical, mental, psychological, emotional, and others, which takes care of the right to education of children, which takes care of their legal rights, their right to criminal justice. If they are adults, we need to look into the sustainable economic empowerment, because there's no recorded data and no firm data on what is the number of victims who get re-trafficked after having been rehabilitated, but the numbers are not very low as we would like to imagine, because victims are often sent back into the same situation which existed at the origin countries, or within their own families from where they had come initially. That situation of poverty, of lack of employment, has not changed, and the victim does need to still find work. So sustainable economic empowerment remains a prime need and right of the victim. If the victim wants to go back home to another country, then repatriation is their right. Rehabilitation, which includes a comprehensive rehabilitation package, is their right. And within all of this, we need to remember the special rights of the child victim to a family, to education, and so on and so forth. And within all of this, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to restore the human dignity of the person who was in exploitation. When we say multi-stakeholder response, we automatically go back to the holistic responses which are prescribed or laid down under the UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol of the year 2000, which we all know is more popularly known as the 3Ps approach, where when we talk of prevention, we think exactly in terms of medicine. Prevention is better than cure. You prevent the crime from happening in the first place. How it can be done, we'll come to that discussion a little later. Protection of the victims once they are rescued from situations of exploitation, protection from their traffickers and perpetrators, protection from societal shame and stigma, sometimes protection from the families which may refuse to accept them back, and protect them and give them a rehabilitation which possibly may not include their families. Prosecution of the offenders. All throughout the course, we have focused on the victims because we are doing this course with a victim-centered approach. We are doing this course from a gender-sensitive and a child-centered approach, but that does not mean that we are taking our eyes off the perpetrators. Someone is a victim of a crime because someone has perpetrated an act, a violation of their rights, because of which they have become victims of crime. And these perpetrators, who are the traffickers, need to be punished, and that prosecution also remains a priority. However, it goes without saying that none of the actors who are supposed to respond to different needs and rights of the victims can do it all by themselves. And therefore, the partnership approach is indeed the best approach. The partnership approach of all agencies, whether they are government or non-government, who step in together, join hands to provide different services to the victims. When we say services to the victims, I would request you to mentally draw a line in the middle of the page. On one side is the needs of the victim, the services that the victims need after they are rescued. And on the other hand is the criminal justice need of the victim. We don't call it the need really, it's the right of the victim to get justice, to get their perpetrators punished, to get compensation if that's what their government provides, to get legal aid. Excuse me. And to get those rights which are given to them by their criminal justice system. And then naturally the responders of both of these kinds of rights and needs would be different. Let's see from the first responder, the primary responder, which is the government. Pardon me, I had a sneezing spell. I needed to take care of that. The government response. The government remains the primary stakeholder. It always will. In my years and years of training in 35 countries of the world, everyone tries to identify the stakeholders. And somehow everyone also mistakenly identifies non-government actors as the prime responders. Non-government actors as in the NGOs. They always identify NGOs, whether it is a training with the police, prosecutors, or judges, whether it's a training with the NGOs, everyone seeks to identify NGOs as the primary responsibility holder to provide prevention, protection, prosecution to the victims. Whereas the truth of the matter is that it will always be the government's responsibility to restore the rights which have been violated of their own citizens, as well as citizens from other countries who've been brought to their countries for exploitation. So the government's primary responsibility stems from the fact that it needs to have a very strong legal system, and a challenge in many countries is that there is a weak or non-existent legal framework. Every 2 years, the UNODC publishes its report on a global report on trafficking in persons. And it lists the number of countries which have got either standalone laws, special laws, or at least a provision within their criminal codes or penal codes on trafficking, making trafficking a distinct crime, defining how trafficking is a crime in their own country. And that itself is a huge progress starting from the year 2000, when only a very few countries had standalone legislations, where very few countries had special provisions within their criminal codes. But in the past 22 years, the countries of the world have made huge progress, and practically every country of the world today now has at least a legal framework which criminalizes trafficking, which criminalizes the activities which traffickers do on their victims, and which defines the rights of the victims. A challenge with government is also weak capacities of the institutions to respond and to make strategies and make plans. Not every country of the world has got national task forces on trafficking. Not every country of the world has got national action plans on trafficking. And what these task forces and plans help to do is to bring together the stakeholders in a more organized manner, to sit at the same table and to discuss how all of them can perform their role better by joining hands. We'll discuss a little more about it later. Even if the government has got good legal frameworks and they've got these good plans and strategies and task forces, there's often the challenge of inadequate allocation of resources, both human and financial, to respond adequately to this crime. And the inadequate allocation doesn't stem from the fact that the government does not sometimes prioritize trafficking. It stems from the fact that the government is dealing with multiple challenges of multiple crimes being committed. And when we go to the government as the UN agencies or the other NGOs request their government, or they demand of their governments that the government should allocate more budgets, more human resources to fight these crimes, the government often asks a question: why should trafficking alone be my priority? Why should gender-based violence or child rights or gender rights or rights of the disabled or right of the children to education or to prevent child labor or to give children education and so on and so forth be my priority? The government turns around and asks that I have a limited budget to every year to provide different services to my citizens. And perhaps for the government, it's more important to provide sanitation. It's more important for the government to provide clean drinking water, just simple vaccination to children, just to reduce infant mortality, just to reduce maternal mortality, just to prevent their citizens from dying from malaria, a very simple disease by itself, or diarrhea among children. You get my point. You get the drift of this conversation. That the government rightly asks, why should I single out trafficking and allocate huge budgets when my own budget to take care of all of these different things is limited? And it is here that, therefore, the multi-stakeholder response becomes equally important. What can the governments do? The governments have to have strong laws, which they are trying to work on constantly. The governments need to ratify international instruments and regional instruments, because that is what showcases their commitment, their dedication, and puts them in a spot where the other member nations of the world can point out to them and say, oh, there is it where you're faulting, or this is where you need to bring up your efforts. It is where the government needs to put their budget and resources. We've just spoken about resources and budget, but whatever be the capacity of the government, whatever be the capacity of the government of, say, Somalia versus the government of USA, whatever be the capacity of the government of Thailand versus, say, the government of Laos, Lao People's Democratic Republic, whatever be the capacity of the government of Nepal versus the government of India. I'm taking examples from the smaller countries to the largest countries that can be imagined. Whatever be the capacities of these different governments, the government should put some resources at least to fight this battle. The government needs to strengthen its institutions and mechanisms, whether it is policing, whether it's prosecution, whether it is judges and courts. whether it is setting up proper shelter homes, whether it is preventing trafficking through generating employment in the more vulnerable areas, which we call the source areas. And the government needs to do all of this by demonstrating a very strong will, a very strong political will, which prioritizes anti-human trafficking initiatives, not at the cost of everything that the governments are supposed to do, not at the cost of neglecting other rights of other citizens, but at the cost definitely of prioritizing the rights of these victims who face horrific crimes, violence, and exploitation. Let's pay attention to some of the responses of the criminal justice system and the challenges that they face. The most important challenge is the lack of reporting. The lack of reporting because either people do not trust the institutions where they're supposed to report. Lack of reporting because people do not know that they are victims of crime and that this can be reported. Lack of trust because they see what has happened to the reports to the other crimes that are made in their country, a general lack of a weak criminal justice system. There's also a culture of silence and tolerance and a non-concern where we accept child labor. There's also a lack of concern, the silence and tolerance to prostitution, where we believe women are doing it out of their own free will, that it's their hobby, that it's a choice which they exercise without trying to find out that, yes, it may be true in some cases, but have we gone deeper to find out whether they're doing it out of a lack of total choicelessness and that they're in the grips of organized criminal gangs who are making them do this work. And that, or maybe that, prostitution is normal in any society, and therefore we cannot do anything to control it or to stop it because it's existed for centuries together. Sometimes when these crimes are reported, a challenge with it for victims and parents is that police does not record the crimes. They want to keep their record, they want to keep their crime data low, and that's a reality in many countries. Police does not record the crimes under the relevant sections of law. They often try to dilute this. They often try to dilute the legal provisions under which they are supposed to register trafficking crimes, because either they've not been successful in prosecuting these crimes before, or because they themselves suffer from a lack of training and capacity building and knowledge and the skills required to investigate such a crime and the sensitivity towards it. The country generally would show low prosecution rates in criminal matters, which may be a result of poor investigation, prosecution, and trial. And a weak criminal justice of any country, with its foundations being weak, will also lead to a low prosecution and a low conviction rate in trafficking cases. When we talk of lack of infrastructure and resources, there's not enough policemen, there's not enough police stations, there's not enough specialized anti-trafficking units, there's not enough trained police personnel to identify the first responders, the frontline responders, the specialist investigators. There's not enough prosecutors who are trained well. There's not enough judges who are trained well. We don't have fast-track courts, special courts to try these crimes, to have faster trials, speedier trials, which would put traffickers behind bars and reduce the threat to the victims and encourage the victims to report these cases. We do not still have, in many countries of the world, separate waiting rooms for victims and offenders. We do not have separate child-friendly police stations for child victims of trafficking. We do not have a closed-circuit television testimony possible in many countries of the world, and victims have to sit in the same courtroom facing the offenders. And these victims could very well be children. And these offenders who are often threatening them, and the victims who really fear the traffickers. So lack of infrastructure and resources can really hamper the justice delivery in many, many ways. And most importantly, the police is doing a different kind of identification, and the border and immigration agencies are doing their own work, and there's barely any coordination between these three agencies, which do the primary role of identifying victims. Now, there's multiple solutions which can be presented on what is it that the criminal justice actors can do. The first and foremost is, apart from the attitudinal roles of building gender sensitivity, victim-centered approach, child-friendly approaches, the first thing that they should do is to just implement the laws of their country better. Implement it within their own, within the constraints of their own resources. Implement it with a sensitive approach, which doesn't really require the need of a law to tell them to be sensitive. Train and build capacities among the criminal justice actors so that the gravity of this crime is understood, so that the psychosocial profile of a victim is understood, and they know why victims do not want to cooperate with police, and to build trust and to encourage the victims to come forward to report and to maybe become witnesses in their own crime. Maybe to become witnesses in their own cases, which strengthens the case of the police, and to do this with the consent of the victim and not to force them to do it. Let's see the other group of stakeholders, the NGOs. NGOs also suffer from a lot of challenges, where primary challenges stem from lack of resources. There's not enough NGOs working on these issues. If they are working, they don't have enough money to set up these shelter homes where victims may require long-term care. NGOs, many a times in many countries, have started ignoring the law enforcement and have been going and doing rescue operations, as I call it. And there are things which I put in inverted commas because they are so ironical. Rescue operations without police are not legal actions, because they cannot arrest the offender, and because they do not have the legal and administrative backing. And therefore, these them by themselves are then become either illegal or invalid. The rehabilitation which NGOs do are again fraught with challenges, because they have to provide so many services to the victims, and there's always lack of resources. Restoration, repatriation itself is a very difficult task, because it involves multiple ministries, ranging from Ministry of Interior to Ministry of Justice to Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the embassy of the country where the victim needs to be repatriated back. If it's a child, there'll be different child protection authorities who would get involved. And it's a very time-consuming process. And if the victim is a witness in her own case, then the courts may not give her the right, may not give her the permission to go back to her own country, but to finish the testimony before she goes, and that takes time. And a major challenge which civil society and NGOs face, and that is because of us also, is their social reintegration. Because you and I also remain very important stakeholders, but we do not understand our role, where we become again now the perpetrators, continuously shaming the victims, continuously attributing stigma to them, because of which the victims again see hopelessness. And they often return back to that same violence and exploitation, because they do not find acceptance from their families, from their relatives, from society at large. And in just picking up a few of these stakeholders, you would have realized that if they all continue to work differently, then there is very little success. But if they synergize their efforts towards prevention, protection, prosecution, efforts which require cross-cutting initiatives, efforts which require equal attention and focus, and not a piecemeal effort on just paying attention to prevention, where yes, the root causes of trafficking need to be removed through employment generation, awareness raising, and other policies of protection of their victims and of prosecution. But how this synergy of efforts is to be achieved? It has to be achieved with this multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary approach of multiple stakeholders working towards a common cause. This approach is required because diverse expertise is needed. The police cannot be the counselor. The counselor does not have the legal powers of a police or the judge. The health professional cannot do what the NGOs do in terms of resettlement and rehabilitation of victims, and so on and so forth. Multiple ministries and departments are involved. Consider the simple example of children in labor who've been rescued from situations of trafficking for forced labor exploitation. Once these children are rescued beyond the other safe home accommodation, food, shelter, clothing, medical assistance, etc., that is needed, which itself involves multiple ministries of child and women, if there are any, ministries of children, Ministry of Labor because it's the labor department, Ministry of Education because the child needs to go back to school, Ministry of Health because the health ministry needs to have a policy on providing health care to victims of trafficking, physical, mental, emotional, all kinds of health. They may require drug rehabilitation and alcohol abuse rehabilitation because victims are often drugged, are often fed alcohol till such time they become addicted to these substance abuses, and they do substance abuse to just continue with the violence and exploitation and succumb to it. There's other ministries involved if it's a foreign child who's been brought to the country for exploitation, which now includes, again, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the embassy of that country. It may involve Interpol. It will involve Ministry of Justice, police, prosecutors, who are the criminal justice actors. It will involve Department of Social Work. It will involve ministries of social protection. There are so many ministries and departments involved, and not at just the central or the federal level, but at the state level, at the provincial level, at the district level, at the lowest level of the village where the government machinery exists. And everyone has to provide their services at almost the same time, or even if simultaneously. Victims need these services together. We cannot say that health is a priority, but education is not. The child needs to go back to school. We cannot say reunion with the family is not a priority because the child needs to be reintegrated within the family if the family is the safe space for the child. And in saying all this, you would have realized by now that no one stakeholder can provide all support and services. Different stakeholders come in at different phases, and therefore a multi-stakeholder approach is required. It benefits all of us. It benefits because we are pooling our expertise together, where police can seek the help of the NGO to go and conduct rescue operation, where the police gets busy with the crime scene to secure the crime scene, to arrest the offenders, to prevent their escape, to maintain the evidence integrity, to secure the evidence collected, store it. Whereas the NGO, which is accompanying the police, would counsel the victims, tell them, first of all, that you are not the criminals. Don't be worried. Don't be afraid. The police is here to rescue you. The police is here to remove you from this exploitative situation. And you are not being charged with a crime, because that's the story that traffickers have often fed the victims, that you are in fact doing illegal activities in this country and we will not be punished, but you would be sent to prison. And at the site of rescue, when the police gets busy with so many other things, NGOs could really be helping in taking care of the victims at the crime scene, counseling them, providing preliminary medical aid and care where it is required. Separating helps police in identifying who the potential victims are and who the potential traffickers are, because these days there are large instances where the traffickers start merging with the victims because the average age of traffickers is becoming lesser and lesser. And they try to infiltrate the victims by claiming that they are also the victims and the traffickers have escaped from the crime scene. And it is many a times NGOs, because of the fact that they can identify much better sometimes, that they can help the police to say, no, this woman is not really, doesn't look like the victim. Look at look at their body behavior, look at the body language of how the other young girls look at this other woman, how she's controlling them with their eyes, and she is possibly the potential trafficker, and these are the victims, and let's not mix them up together. That is the meaning of pooling of expertise. That everyone works together, they converge their actions so that we have more sustainable results. By sustainable results, we simply mean that victims, once they are rehabilitated and they receive the services, they do not get re-trafficked. They do not go back to a life of violence and exploitation. And we become all better organized. There's optimum resource utilization, but we become as organized as the organized criminal syndicates. And having given you these examples, there are many, many more where NGOs can work together with businesses. There are many more stakeholders which we have identified in the pre-recorded lecture of week 6. There are tons of examples to be taken of how businesses form partnerships with NGOs. No longer corporate social responsibility, but corporate social partnership between the NGO and the business houses, whether it's a big hospital, which tells the NGO, give me your victims, give me our victims, I will train them and I will employ them in my hospital, in the work which is appropriate for them to perform. Where hotels, big hotels will say, give me your victims, or survivors for that matter, give me your victims, I will train them in the art of catering, and I will employ them in the kitchen of in my hotel or in other departments at my hotel. Like big construction companies, such as many examples in India, they approach the NGOs and the NGOs which are helping trafficked victims by training the victims to become masons, a job hitherto done only by men, and training them to work on construction sites and building roads. There are many more such examples. And where private industry also steps up to take prevention measures themselves, such as the internet service providers, who make internet a safe space for children and other citizens and other men, women, and children. Because now cyber facilitated trafficking is moving trafficking online, where recruitment is happening online, the dynamics of control are happening online, as well as the financial transactions are moving online. I'm just taking these random examples to give you a flair, a taste of what each one of us can do, even if it be a big Google or it is a small person like you and me. I say small from the potential that we all have, from our reach that we all have in working on this cause. And I bring you now to the last slide and request you to give your attention to this very favorite quote of mine, that you may be one person in this world, but to that one person, you may be the entire world. Take that first step. Take on the responsibility that your work and your life provides you. We may not get to work with the victims, but we can talk about this to our neighbors, to our friends, to our relatives, to our own family. We may not be the policeman who has the opportunity to remove victims from exploitative situations and get them justice. But we can spread awareness about this issue. We can go and volunteer our time and help victims settle down. Even if we do nothing, that's one thing we can do, is to create an atmosphere of safety and trust for the victims who are returning back home. It is we collectively as a society who does what is known as tertiary victimization, the third stage of victimization, which creates so much shame and stigma for any victim of any crime, but especially of sexual crimes, that the victims see no hope of reintegration within families and within societies. There's so much that we can do individually, and there's so much more that can be done collectively. Let's join hands and let's fight this battle of trafficking. Thank you all very much. I hope you have all enjoyed this course of 6 weeks. Please do not hesitate to be in touch with me after the course ends. I'm still in touch with the students who participated in the course more than 5 years and 6 years back. I would love to know of how you're using this knowledge in the future, either to work on this issue or to work on any other issue, but you're able to implement the learnings from this particular course. And generally be in touch. And whenever you are in India, please do let me know. And if I'm in your country, I will surely let you know. so that we can meet together and we can discuss some more about human trafficking and how to find solutions to fight this crime. Thank you all very, very much.